Hey guys, HackerSploit here, back again with another video, and welcome back to the Red Team series. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to utilize the MITRE ATT&CK Navigator for mapping adversarial or APT TTPs, and more importantly, how to use it to plan Red Team operations, how to use it to provide feedback, or how to use it to aid your reporting, after you've completed a red team operation. More specifically, how to give more credence to your reporting, I should say, especially when trying to communicate your findings to the blue team or the defenders within an organization that, again, you perform the red team operation on. Now, this video builds on the previous video, the preceding video, where I introduced you to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. The Navigator is sort of a really cool tool that, again, is open source, free to use, that allows you to operationalize it, or allows you to operationalize the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So if you're interested, or you started getting excited based on what I showed you in the previous video when we were taking a look at various APT groups, this will be even more exciting. So I'm just, don't worry, the theoretical aspect of this video is going to be fairly minimal, but first thing you need to do is understand what the Navigator is. So what is the MITRE ATT&CK Navigator? The MITRE ATT&CK Navigator is an open source tool designed to help users, or I should say red teamers, explore and operationalize the MITRE ATT&CK framework, more specifically the knowledge base. So it provides basic navigation and annotation of the attack matrices, something that people are already doing today in tools like Excel. You can use the Navigator to visualize your defensive coverage, your red or blue team planning, the frequency of detected techniques, or anything else you want to do. It also allows you to manipulate the cells in the matrix, or the techniques or sub-techniques as it were, through color coding, adding a comment, assigning a numerical value, which is a game changer, as you'll see. And the principal feature of the ATT&CK Navigator is the ability for users to define layers, which are essentially custom views of the attack knowledge base. For example, showing just those techniques for a particular platform, or highlighting techniques a specific adversary has been known to use. So this is what it looks like. You can see it allows you to pretty much play around with the attack framework, or the various matrices, and highlight, annotate different stuff that's important to you. Now, one thing I would like to explain before we get into the practical demo is you can use the ATT&CK Navigator for whatever you want to use it for. I'm going to be giving you some examples of how I've used it, and hopefully that can show you the power not just of the ATT&CK Navigator itself as a tool, but also the attack framework. Because remember, the ATT&CK Navigator is simply something that operationalizes the attack framework more so the knowledge base. But with that being said, let me switch back over into my browser, and we can kick off the practical demo here. All right, so I'm currently in my browser. Now you can access the MITRE ATT&CK Navigator by just searching for it on Google. The URL which will be added to the description of this video is mitre-attack.github.io ATT&CK Navigator. By the way, given that the ATT&CK Navigator is open source, you can actually take a look at their GitHub repo, and you can self-host your own deployment, or your own instance of the ATT&CK Navigator if you don't want to use the public, the public one that's available, or that's been provided to you by MITRE. So that's one way. The other way, which again, this is typically if you are familiar, or if you've been using it for a while, is, let's say I'm researching, I'm now back on the MITRE ATT&CK framework primary website. Let's say I'm, again, I'll click on a different technique than I did in the previous video. Let's say I am taking a look at privilege escalation, or actually let's go to lateral movement, and I'm taking a look at a technique like, let's see, not hijacking, remote lateral movement through remote services, more specifically RDP, right? So I click on this, I can see the various APT groups, or the procedure example. So all the groups or threats or adversaries or APT groups that have used this specific technique before, or in one of their campaigns or operations. So let's say APT 41, right? I click on the group here, and now if I just scroll to where, you know, where it highlights the techniques used, I can actually open up the attack navigator layer for this specific APT group, which is APT 41, right? And what this will do is it'll open up the attack navigator layer, and it'll show you, or it'll actually highlight on the attack matrix, the attack enterprise matrix, what TTPs APT 41 has been known to use or has used previously. So I'll click on view here. You can also download it, and you want to give it a few seconds. It'll open up a new attack navigator tab or session, and you can see, all right, okay, so you know, a lot of stuff highlighted. Before, you know, and I'll explain how all of this works, but if you want to collapse all the sub techniques because they're currently expanded, you can do that here. And now you can see that you have color coding again juxtaposed against the MITRE ATT&CK enterprise matrix, representing the TTPs that APT 41 has used or has been known to use during their operations or campaigns. So you can see this is very important, because one thing I want you to see is that not you know, an attacker doesn't need to go through each of these tactics. For example, credential access, there probably is. You can actually see this highlighted here, where there are sub techniques. You can see that 1 out of 4 sub technique is highlighted, and indeed they perform some password cracking. But you may be asking yourself, well, why on earth are some color coded pink, blue, red? Well, if you open this up here, you can see that right over here, it says that 0 out of 5, or has a score of 1. In this case, it's not really using a score, but it just represents the use of that particular technique or sub technique in a campaign, or the frequency of use. So you can see 3 out of 13. And we can actually see, if we take a look at the color setup here, is it providing anything there? Actually, no. So anyway, this is what it allows you to do. So if you're ever, you know, performing adversary emulation, this gives you, you know, a very good idea of what TTPs a particular APT group used if you're emulating the particular APT group or adversary or threat actor. Now, that was sort of a very blunt introduction to the attack, the MITRE ATT&CK Navigator. We're going to start from scratch, right? So I'm going to go back to the home page of the Attack Navigator, and you can see you can create multiple tabs, and that's because you can create multiple layers. Now I'll explain why the provision for multiple layers is so cool or so important. The other thing you can do is obviously change this to a light theme, if you know that's better for your eyes. I personally don't really have a preference, but then over here you can see that it says the Attack Navigator is a web-based tool for annotating and exploring the attack matrices. It can be used to visualize defensive coverage, pretty much what I said in the slides. And you have the ability to create a new layer, open an existing layer. So if you downloaded a layer, let's say from the attack website for APT 41, you can just upload it here, or you can create a layer from other layers. So you can inherit, you can select the layers you want to inherit properties from, and you can create a customized navigator if you so wish. Now, we are really interested in creating a new layer. So the examples that I wanted to use as a means of explaining how to use the Attack Navigator are going to really open your mind to just how powerful this tool is. Before I get into any of those examples, I am obviously going to give you a tour of the interface. So we're going to create a new empty layer. Now, you can specify the matrix that you want. So enterprise attack, mobile attack, and that'll consequently give you the TTPs relevant or corresponding to those to the specific matrix that you clicked on. Now, if you're not familiar with what the MITRE ATT&CK matrices are, you can refer to the previous video where I introduced you to the attack framework, but I'm going under the assumption that you already know what you're doing. The other thing you can do is specify the version of attack that you want to use. Again, because new versions are released that include updates and changes to the IDs or changes to the technique or sub-technique IDs, this provision or this has been made available to you. So why is this important? Well, let's say you did a lot of your work or your red team operations using the MITRE ATT&CK v14 knowledge base. Well, in that case, again, if you want to still keep it standardized or still continue using that, you can. And likewise, you can also tell the blue team, for example, that, hey, we used MITRE ATT&CK version 14, so that they can, again, are able to correctly identify the techniques or sub-technique IDs, let's say if you use them. So we can just go for the enterprise attack here, and that'll create a new empty canvas or a new empty layer. Now we're going to start at the top. So firstly, you have the ability to select techniques across tactics. What this means is if I click on a particular technique, I don't know whether you can see it, but it actually highlights the technique with a blue border here. That means it's selected, and it means I can do something to it. So by the way, you can deselect it by clicking on it, but you can also select sub-techniques with a parent. So let's say I click on a technique that has sub-techniques, and you can tell what technique has a sub-technique or sub-techniques by taking a look at this right over here, which tells you the number of sub-techniques. So right now selected are 0 out of 6, which means there's 6 sub-techniques, and you can expand it with this little toggle button here, and now you can see it brings up all of the sub-techniques under that technique. So if you select this option here to select sub-techniques with a parent, what this means is if I click now on the technique itself, it'll also select the sub-techniques right over here. And likewise, if I unselect and I now select a sub-technique, it'll highlight everything or all other sub-techniques and the technique that the sub-technique falls under. So let me unselect that and let me uncheck that. And you can also enable the option to select only visible techniques, which is not really important now. You can then perform a search, which we'll get into. This allows you to search the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base. Really cool stuff we'll cover shortly. And you can then deselect techniques. So again, if you want to select multiple techniques, you can see that if I click one and click another, it selects the most recently clicked one and then deselects the other one. If you want to click multiple techniques, you can use your control key on your keyboard and then click the others. And now you can see all of the ones I've selected or all of the ones I've clicked are now selected, and they have that blue border, right? And I can deselect them by just clicking on this button here. So you can see deselect 4 techniques. So those are your selection controls, very important. You then have your layer controls, where you can now provide a name to your layer. So let's say we'll call this one APT 29 because we're using it to essentially view or assess the TTPs of that particular APT group. You can then add metadata and links if you want, that's up to you. And you can then export your MITRE ATT&CK layer either in the form of JSON, which means you can then re-import it into the ATT&CK Navigator whenever you want and modify it, or you can export it, export this single layer into an Excel spreadsheet, which is very useful, or render the layer into an SVG file or into an image. And you can also specify whether you can click on this option here to only download annotations on visible techniques. So those are your export options. You then have your filters, where you can now filter your platform. So let's say I only want TTPs relevant to Windows, right? Well, I can then unselect all of the other ones here not applicable to Windows. I'll leave Azure AD, or you can actually uncheck it. And then you can sort your techniques or sub-techniques, alphabetically, ascending or descending in order. And then you have your color setup. Now, I'll get into this shortly, because this is very, very useful if you know what you're doing. And then you can show hide disabled. So, if I click on this right over here and I right click on a technique that I've selected, you can disable a particular technique or sub-technique. So for example, if I add this to a selection, and I then, went ahead and said show hide disabled. Actually, hold on a moment. Let me show you this here. So if I right click here, select annotated, deselect. No, hold on a second. One moment. Let me just make sure that's not clicking. Select techniques. Yes, that is correct. 1 second. Toggle. Yeah, there we are. So forgotten that was there. So you can toggle that as disabled. Before it was in the right click menu, but now if I say show hide disabled, it'll hide that one. So you can actually disable the stuff you don't want. Let me re-enable that. I can deselect the technique there, and then you have the ability to expand sub techniques, which will now show all sub techniques, right? I can then expand the annotated sub techniques if you've annotated, and I can then collapse sub techniques to go back. So if I right click on a technique or sub technique, I can actually annotate on top of it. So for example, by the way, you can do that here. So you can add a comment, and we'll get into that, but there we are. So you then have the matrix configuration where you can specify the layout. So the side layout is the one you're seeing now. The flat layout just makes the tiles flat. You then have the mini layout, which is right over here. We go back to the original. You can also show the IDs. So that will now show the ID, the sub-technique IDs on the actual technique or sub-technique cards here. And that can be very useful. We can get rid of that there. You can also show the aggregate scores. This will become relevant in a few seconds. And yeah, so that's the layer controls. Now, for the technique controls, this is where things get really cool. If I go into initial access, or let's say maybe, the technique we used as an example in the previous set of videos, once I select a particular technique, and let me use one that's not linked. So for example, internal spear phishing, or actually, hold on, let me find one that makes a little bit more sense here. So if I go into lateral movement, actually, let's take a look at access token manipulation, right? So when I click on that technique, you can see that the technique controls, they were previously grayed out, but when I click on a technique, they now become active, right? So I can toggle the state to disable it, as I've already explained, and I can set a color. So this is where you can do your color coding. Now, as I said, this is entirely up to you. When I'm doing or planning a red team operation, I typically use red just to, again, it's just the color coding that I like, right? You can change it to whatever you want. For whatever reason, you can use whatever color coding you want. I'll just go back to the default, and now we have scoring. Now, this is very, very, very important, and don't worry why it's important. I'll explain and show you why it's important. You can then add a comment if you want to the selected techniques. You can add a link if you want, very, very useful, and you can add metadata, or you can clear annotations on the selected, and more importantly, you can disable the sticky toolbar or enable it right over here. So now you are familiar with the interface. You can see we've renamed this. Let me rename it correctly here to APT29, not AP29, APT29. And again, we'll go with the first example where I want to map the TTPs for APT29, because let's say I'm performing adversary emulation and I would like to know what TTPs APT29 has used or is using. So I can now open the search. Under selection controls, open the search and multi-select, and you can now search for different techniques, sub-techniques, groups, software. So for example, in the case of software, if I search for Cobalt Strike, let's see, you can see right over here, we have software, and I can select Cobalt Strike. And now this will tell me what techniques or sub-techniques Cobalt Strike again can perform or has been used to perform in the case of groups. Now, I'll go back into search and I'll search for APT29, right? And you want to go to threat groups, and you can now select all the TTPs, all the known TTPs that APT29 is used previously or again is still using. So if I click on select all, you can now see that all the TTPs are now selected. You can see they have the blue border. And I can now do what I usually do, just apply a color that allows me to easily identify them. And you can click on the search icon to close that up. And now I can see all the techniques and sub-techniques that APT29 is used or has that is used or is again still using. And I can then I can expand the sub-techniques, or I can do that at my own I can do that whenever I want. So you can see under account discovery, looks like they performed domain account discovery, so on and so forth. So I now have an idea of, okay, looks like they did all of this. If I'm doing adversary simulation and I can make a few changes to the emulation plan, I can modify a couple of things. So what I typically like doing if I'm making changes to the adversary emulation plan, so I'm using APT29's TTPs as a basis, but I want to add on to this, right? I want to make it maybe a little bit more comprehensive. Well, I typically then select the TTPs that I want to incorporate or add on to this adversary emulation campaign. And let's say I go ahead and let me add one more like this one. I then add a different color just so that I know that, okay, this one is mine. We are adding, sorry, my bad. I had selected that orange. So let me show you how to correct that. So I select all of APT29's groups, change it back to red. And that's a very important. So why is this? There we are. So go back to red and there we are. So the ones I had highlighted previously, or the additional ones I now highlight in orange. What that tells me and my team is that this is what we're adding onto APT29's TTPs. So this is sort of a new, it's a improved or augmented adversary emulation plan, right? And there you are. So that's how you can do that. Now, this is for planning. Now, let's say I'm just performing a standard red team operation. So I'll create a new layer here, and I'll go ahead and let's see, I want to, let's remove everything to do with, we just want Windows here. So as the platform. So let's say I'm now planning a red team operation, right? Not adversary emulation. We're not using any APT group. We're just going to say, okay, for initial access, we want to use the following techniques. So we want to target the company's public-facing applications, the external remote services. Remember, to select more than one technique, use the control key, hold it down. We want to do some phishing, more specifically spear phishing attachments. In terms of execution, we are going to use PowerShell, because we'll be using PowerShell Empire as our command and control framework. Let's see, persistence, account manipulation. No, let's try and do, let's see. We want to create some accounts. So we want to create both domain and local accounts for our persistence, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. So I, again, use something like red, standard red team operation right over here. And I can use that as a basis. Now, when the operation is ongoing, I can use this, the same layer, but make a few adjustments to it. So what if I specify that I don't want any color, right? So they're still selected, but now I want to use a scoring system to determine which of the selected techniques or sub-techniques we were successful in executing or performing. So in order to do that, this is where we now need to set up, or go to our color setup, and we can use a color gradient or a scoring gradient where we can assign values, or we can assign a color to specific values or a score. So you have your presets here where you can go red to green, right? Or green to red. In our case, I typically like going red to green, red indicating that red being 0, or 0 representing red, yellow representing 1. You can start it from wherever you want. So we can go, let's say red to green, and then I can say that the low value is 0 and the high value is, let's say, 3. So that means 0, would be red, 1 maybe yellow, orangish, 2 and 3 will be green. So that means when when I assign a score of 3, the color of the selected technique on the navigator should be green. So the way I use this now, again, remember the, what's it called? The techniques that I selected are still selected here. But now instead of adding a color manually, I can now use scoring to determine whether we were successful. So let's say when we start the operation, all techniques or sub-techniques that we selected that we're planning to run or execute during the operation, we're going to set that to 0. So it's red. Now, as the operation continues, let's say I'm now going to deselect them. And let's say as the operation continues, or when we start performing or when we're running the red team operation, we see that phishing was successful. I can now set the score to 3. And now we now can essentially, this is not just useful for us as the red team, but we can also communicate this to the organization, but also the blue team and say, this is what we were successful at. The rest of the stuff, it looked like you either defended against it or we weren't able to, again, for example, exploit the public facing applications to gain access. So for example, let's say, this was successful right over here. Let me uncheck these two. So we're then going to assign the score. Let's say the score for this was also 3. But we had a bit of trouble with creating domain accounts, but we were able to. So I'll set the score to 1. You can now see that's yellow. Local accounts, we had a score of, let's say, 3. That was successful. My bad. Let me just unselect this here. I'm going to say domain. We had a score of 1. So there we are. Make sure you deselect the stuff. So this is one or rather 2 examples of how I use it. So now during the operation, we know what was successful and not. Now remember, you can use whatever scoring system you want, or whatever color gradient you want, and that's entirely up to you. You can also use whatever low or high values you want. If you're using percentage, you can do that as well, so on and so forth. And now I can communicate this to the blue team. Now, when I typically am communicating stuff to the blue team, and again, I'll now use APT 29 as an example and just select the TTPs here. So I'll just select and I'll set, let's say, let us use a color setup of, again, 0 to 3 with the, we will say, let's go green to red, where green represents the value or score of 0 and 1 or 3 represents red. So that means if I was now communicating this to the blue team, what I would do now, for all that I've selected, we're going to start with 0, right? So I'm going to set all the baseline score to 0. That means I'm telling the so we're starting with 0. So if the score is 0, that means that we were not successful as the red team, in executing that technique. Now, if we select the score of, if we select, let's say, some sub techniques here, and we set the score to 3, then from the blue team perspective, the ones with a higher score, with a score of anywhere from above, 0 to 3, essentially communicates the fact that this is where you guys need to improve, or these were techniques that the red team were able to execute successfully without, again, being defended, without being detected or defended against. So there's many ways of, again, using the attack navigator. It's entirely up to you, whatever color coding you want to use. That's how to do it. Now, the final example I'll use, and this is one way that I use it, I use it actually with my work, is when planning an adversary emulation campaign, or even quite a comprehensive red team operation where we're not just emulating one adversary, but we want to, let's say, use the TTPs of several adversaries or APT groups and combine them in order to allow us to come up with a campaign that's holistic and all-encompassing of the TTPs of more than one APT group. So let's say we want to emulate or simulate the TTPs of firstly APT29, right? So I'll search for that group here. So we'll create one layer and we'll say APT29. I'll go into the thread groups here, select all, and now I'll assign, and this needs to be consistent. So we'll go from, we will go red to green. I'll set the score from 0 to 3, okay? Actually, we'll go 0 to 5, I'll explain why. And now I'm going to say the baseline score here is going to be 1. So that means that these are, actually we'll go with 0 here. So that's red. So APT29, these are the TTPs. Excellent. So now, let me deselect that and that. So we have APT29 TTPs. Let me rename this because this is very important. So APT29. And now let's create another layer. Let's say there's another APT group whose TTPs we want to emulate. So I'll now say search. Maybe we'll say APT28. Let's go, yeah, APT28. This is also Russian, although I know they are linked. So we'll select that here. I'll now use the same color setup where we'll say red. Did we use red to green? Yes, we did. So red to green, 0 to 5. It's very important that you keep the same. And then the score here, we will set it to 0. There we are. Actually, we want to set this to 1 in both instances. Let me just modify this. So we'll say 0 to 3. Let's just set it here. What was the score I set here? So 1. What did we select? We selected red to green. Yes. Okay. So low value is 1. There we are. Okay. So it's 1 to, let's go 1 to 5. I'll set the score here to 1. Okay, let me go back to APT29. Let me search for their TTPs. Apologies for the confusion. Just want to make sure I use this correctly. So I'll select it again. The color setup is 1 to 5, green, red to green, and then the scoring for each is 1. Okay, so don't worry if you're a little bit confused. This will make sense in a second. So they all have a score of 1. So that means, you know, these TTPs have occurred once. What we're doing by taking a look or combining the TTPs from multiple groups, APT groups, is maybe in addition to combining or getting a collective set of TTPs that encompasses the TTPs of more than one APT group, we may want to look for commonalities in the TTPs between more than one group. So we have APT29 here. Let me just check the score. This is the APT28 layer. Let me just select or rename this here. So we'll now say APT28. Okay. We have the second layer. Now we'll go and create the final layer. And we can now, let's say, use APT30. We can go with APT. Yeah, let's go APT30. So I'll select the TTPs for APT30. Actually, it looks like, let's deselect that. Do we have APT39? We do. Let's go APT39. We'll use the same color setup. So red to green, 1 to 5, max 5 value being 5, and then we'll set the score to 1. Okay, so all of the layers are all consistent in terms of their scoring as well as the color setup. So now let me rename this to APT39. Now this is where the attack navigator really becomes powerful, because again, let's use the use case that I wanted to see the collective TTPs or all the TTPs of all these three groups in one layer. That's one example. The second use case is to see the commonalities or what TTPs these groups share between them. And that's why we set the scoring system. So that means now in the new layer that we'll create, that combines all these three layers, that all techniques that have a cumulative score of more than 1, which means they occur more than once amongst these 3 APT groups, they'll obviously have a different color, so they'll be green. And then I can say, these look to be like the TTPs that these groups share amongst themselves. Let's use those TTPs, given that they're the most common against these 3 groups. Now, the criteria for selecting an APT group for an adversary emulation campaign is beyond the scope of this video, but let's go ahead and combine the layer. So we want to open up a new tab and say create layer from other layers. And in this case, we can leave that, we'll go for the latest here, 15, the score expression. So in this case, what we want is, it's asking us how do we want to combine the layers. So A plus B plus C. So you can see at the top here, each tab has its own, so you can see A, B, C. In this case, use constant or numbers. Yeah, A plus B does not match the chosen domain. That's weird. Wait a moment. Sorry, this is version 15. Yes, it is. Color coding 1 to 5. Let me just make sure this is all the same. 1 to 5. Yes. Red to green. 1 to 5. This slide says, I was trying to create one from existing ones. Why is that? I was clicking on the wrong thing. It's enterprise. So A plus B plus C. There we are. So it's going to combine these 3 layers, APT 29, 28, and 39. And then the gradient that we want to use is the one from APT 29, because it's the same. The coloring APT 29. And then we can just create the layer. And there we are. Fantastic. So now you can see that the ones that are color coded in red means they, amongst all of these 3 groups, that TTP or that technique or sub-technique only exists once, which means only one of these groups uses that specific TTP, has been known to use that technique or sub-technique. If it's yellow, in this case, it's going to be green. So it's supposed to be green, but it's yellow because we set the color setup to be 1 to 5, right? If we change it to 3 in this layer, the ones that the groups share amongst themselves will be highlighted in green. The ones in yellow will again means that 2 of the groups amongst the 3 share that technique or sub-technique. So now what this can tell me is, it looks like these 3 APT groups, they seem to have these techniques or sub-techniques in common. And then I can use this or extrapolate this information and maybe again use it in an adversary emulation or simulation campaign or for my own red team operation. So that's the third and final example that I wanted to go through, and hopefully these set of examples and this demonstration explained how to utilize the MITRE ATT&CK Navigator again for planning red team operations, communicating report the results to the blue team, mapping adversarial TTPs for adversary emulation, and then of course combining layers to generate a heat map, again the criteria of which or the results of which you are is entirely dependent on you, depending on what scoring system you want to use or the color gradient you want to use. So it's entirely up to you at the end of the day how what color coding you want to use or what scoring you want to use. But with that being said, that's going to be it for this video. If you enjoyed this video or found value in it, please leave a like down below. If you have any comments or questions, you can again drop them in the comment section, or you can take a look at the forum thread or forum post for this particular video and this subject on the HackerSploit forum, accessible under or via forum.hackersploit.org, a link to which is in the description section, as well as the comment section. You should see it as the pinned comment. But with that being said, that's going to be it for this video, and I will be seeing you in the next video.